Leonardo da Vinci is remembered for paintings displayed in museums. But the majority of his work was never meant to be displayed at all. Between the 1480s and his death in 1519, Leonardo filled thousands of pages with designs, diagrams, and technical observations. These pages were not organized books. They were notebooks, scattered, fragmented, written in reverse, and rarely shared. Many of these pages describe machines that were never built, not because Leonardo lacked skill, and not because the ideas were incomplete. Some of them were deliberately kept on paper. Leonardo designed advanced military devices while working for Ludovico Sforza in Milan. Armored vehicles with rotating cannons, multi-barrel firing systems, mechanical solutions intended to increase the efficiency of killing on the battlefield. At the same time, he filled pages with studies of human anatomy that went far beyond accepted knowledge. He dissected bodies in secret. He documented muscles, organs, and skeletal structures with a level of precision that challenged medical understanding of the time. These activities were not neutral. Dissection without formal approval was forbidden in many regions of Italy. Military designs that altered the balance of power were politically sensitive. Knowledge that challenged religious or institutional authority could not be openly circulated. Leonardo understood this. He wrote many of his technical notes in mirror script, readable only when reflected. He avoided publishing treatises. He rarely explained the full implications of his designs to patrons. Some inventions appeared only once in his notebooks and were never mentioned again. Others were refined repeatedly but never constructed. This raises a fundamental question. If Leonardo was capable of building these machines, why did he choose not to? Were these ideas technically impossible at the time, or socially dangerous? Were they impractical or simply too disruptive to reveal? This video examines the inventions Leonardo designed but never released, the machines he kept confined to paper, and the reasons these ideas remained hidden while others were celebrated. Because what Leonardo chose not to build may reveal more about his world and his caution than the works he completed. In 1482, Leonardo da Vinci left Florence and traveled to Milan with a clear objective. He was not looking for artistic recognition. He was looking for protection, stability, and patronage. Milan was ruled by Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro. His position was unstable. He was not the rightful duke by inheritance and relied on military strength and political maneuvering to maintain power. What Sforza needed most was not beauty. It was advantage. Leonardo understood this. Instead of presenting himself primarily as a painter, Leonardo wrote a letter to Sforza outlining his capabilities as a military engineer. The letter still exists. In it, Leonardo barely mentions art. Instead, he lists methods for designing bridges, fortifications, siege engines, and weapons capable of altering the outcome of warfare. Among the designs that followed were several machines that pushed far beyond existing military technology. One of them was a heavily armored vehicle, circular in shape, equipped with angled metal plating and surrounded by multiple cannons. The design allowed for 360-degree fire while protecting those inside. On paper, it resembled a mobile fortress. Another set of designs focused on multi-barrel artillery systems. These were intended to fire in rapid succession, increasing rate of fire at a time when reloading was slow and exposed soldiers to danger. Leonardo was not improving weapons incrementally. He was rethinking how violence could be delivered efficiently. He also produced designs for advanced siege mechanisms, scalable ladders, reinforced battering systems, and collapsible bridges intended for rapid troop movement. Each design addressed specific weaknesses in contemporary warfare. What is striking is not that Leonardo imagined these machines. It is that none of them were built or deployed in combat. Some scholars have noted technical flaws in certain designs, such as reversed gear mechanisms that would prevent motion. Whether these flaws were mistakes or intentional limitations remains debated. But the pattern is consistent. The most disruptive machines remained theoretical. Leonardo was working inside a political environment where military innovation carried enormous consequences. A machine that shifted the balance of power could destabilize alliances, provoke retaliation, or threaten the patron himself if control was lost. Sforza wanted superiority, but superiority came with risk. Leonardo continued refining these designs in his notebooks, adjusting proportions, angles, and mechanisms. Yet he did not push for their construction. He documented them, he preserved them, and he kept them confined to paper. This suggests awareness. Leonardo understood that weapons do not exist in isolation. They reshape power structures. They alter who controls violence. And once introduced, they cannot be easily withdrawn. In Milan, Leonardo learned that some ideas were too powerful to release lightly. Not because they were impossible, but because they could not be controlled once made real. This was not hesitation. It was calculation, and it marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. Leonardo da Vinci did not invent flight as a fantasy. He approached it as a technical problem that could be observed, measured, and solved. During the late 1480s and 1490s, Leonardo devoted extensive time to studying birds. He recorded wing shapes, muscle movement, air resistance, and balance. These observations appear repeatedly across multiple notebooks, especially in what later became known as sections of the Codex on the flight of birds. Leonardo was not asking whether humans could fly. He was asking how. One of his most detailed concepts was the ornithopter, a machine designed to allow a human operator to generate lift through controlled wing movement, modeled directly on avian mechanics. Leonardo calculated leverage, joint movement, and force distribution with precision unusual for his time. Another design, far more radical, was the aerial screw, a helical structure intended to rise vertically when rotated, using air itself as resistance. While often described as a primitive helicopter, the concept relied on an understanding of airflow that would not be formally described for centuries. These designs were not isolated sketches. They were refined repeatedly. Measurements were adjusted. Materials were reconsidered. Weight distribution was recalculated. Leonardo knew the limitations. There were no engines capable of sustained mechanical power. Available materials were too heavy. Human muscle alone could not generate sufficient lift. He noted these constraints explicitly in his writings. And yet, he continued. This raises an important distinction. Leonardo was not trying to build a working aircraft in his lifetime. He was mapping the principles of flight. He was defining the conditions under which flight would one day become possible. But presenting such ideas publicly carried risk. Flight was not merely a technical challenge. It was a conceptual disruption. The idea that humans could leave the ground challenged religious symbolism, social hierarchy, and the perceived limits of human capability. In a world structured around divine order and fixed roles, flight suggested transgression. Leonardo did not propose these machines to patrons. He did not offer them as commissions. He did not seek funding to construct prototypes. He kept the work confined to his notebooks. Some pages show signs of hesitation. Notes break off mid-thought. Diagrams are left without final annotations. In several cases, references to flight appear once and are not revisited for years. This was not abandonment. It was containment. Leonardo understood that ideas do not exist independently of the society that receives them. A machine that could not yet function could still provoke fear, ridicule, or suspicion. By keeping these designs private, Leonardo avoided public confrontation with forces that were not prepared to accept them. He preserved the knowledge without forcing its premature exposure. The result is striking. Centuries later, engineers would return to these pages and recognize principles that aligned with modern aerodynamics. Lift, drag, center of mass, rotational force. Concepts Leonardo identified through observation rather than formal mathematics. But in his own time, these ideas remained invisible. Not because Leonardo lacked courage, but because he understood timing. Flight was not forbidden by law. It was forbidden by context. And Leonardo chose patience over provocation. Leonardo da Vinci's most dangerous work was not mechanical. It was biological. Beginning in the late 1480s and continuing intermittently for decades, Leonardo conducted human dissections in hospitals across Florence, Milan, and later Rome. These dissections were not symbolic or superficial. They were systematic. He dissected muscles layer by layer. He separated tendons. He examined organs in place before removing them. He studied the spine, the joints, the hands, the face. He opened the skull to understand the structure of the brain. This work was not standard practice. Human dissection in Renaissance Italy existed, but it was tightly controlled. University anatomists followed established texts, primarily those of Galen, whose authority had gone largely unquestioned for over 1,000 years. Dissections were demonstrations meant to confirm accepted knowledge, not challenge it. Leonardo did the opposite. His drawings reveal repeated corrections of Galenic anatomy. He identified inaccuracies in descriptions of the heart, the liver, the reproductive system, and the structure of the spine. He observed that the heart functioned as a muscle, not as a passive vessel. He documented the flow of blood through valves with a precision that anticipated later discoveries by centuries. Leonardo did not merely illustrate anatomy. He analyzed it. He worked closely with Marcantonio della Torre, a professor of anatomy at the University of Pavia. Together, they planned a comprehensive anatomical treatise based entirely on direct observation. It was meant to replace inherited authority with evidence. That book was never published. Part of the reason was practical. Della Torre died in 1511, cutting short their collaboration. But the deeper reason was institutional. Leonardo's findings did not fit within accepted frameworks. Publishing them would have required confronting universities, physicians, and religious authorities simultaneously. It would have meant asserting that centuries of medical teaching were wrong. There was no system in place to protect someone making that claim. Leonardo continued his anatomical work quietly. He refined his drawings. He added notes. He revised conclusions. But he did not circulate the material widely. He did not seek formal approval. He did not argue publicly. Some dissections were conducted under uncertain authorization. Others likely occurred without permission. This alone placed him in a vulnerable position. Anatomy was tolerated when it reinforced doctrine. It became dangerous when it undermined it. Leonardo understood this boundary. His notebooks show caution. Observations are precise, but conclusions are restrained. Revolutionary insights remain embedded in diagrams rather than declared in text. The knowledge is present, but the challenge is muted. What Leonardo uncovered had the potential to change medicine. But revealing it openly would have required confronting institutions that controlled legitimacy, education, and authority. He chose restraint, not because the knowledge was incomplete, but because the consequences were unpredictable. Leonardo preserved his anatomical discoveries in silence. They survived, but without influence. Centuries later, anatomists would recognize how accurate his observations had been. But in his lifetime, this knowledge remained confined to private pages. This was not secrecy for mystery's sake. It was self-preservation, and it represents the clearest example of why some of Leonardo's most advanced work remained unseen, not because it could not be known, but because it could not be safely revealed. Leonardo da Vinci did not separate mechanical knowledge from its consequences. He understood that technology does not remain neutral once it is applied. Across multiple notebooks, Leonardo explored systems designed to multiply force. Gear trains, transmission mechanisms, automated movement, and compound machines appear repeatedly in his drawings. These were not decorative concepts. They were functional designs intended to reduce human effort while increasing output. Leonardo studied how motion could be transferred efficiently, how rotational force could be converted into linear movement, how small inputs could generate larger effects through carefully calculated ratios. These principles were not revolutionary in isolation. What made them dangerous was how far Leonardo pushed them. He designed automated hammers capable of continuous operation, mechanical saws that could cut with minimal human intervention, lifting devices that allowed fewer workers to move heavier loads. Each of these machines hinted at a future where control no longer depended solely on manpower. In Renaissance Italy, this mattered. Power was measured in labor, in soldiers, in workers, in bodies. Whoever controlled manpower controlled production, construction, and warfare. Any system that reduced dependence on human labor threatened existing hierarchies. Leonardo's machines implied efficiency that guilds could not regulate, automation that city authorities could not easily supervise, tools that shifted power away from skilled labor and toward those who owned the mechanisms. These designs were not theoretical exercises. Leonardo calculated stress, friction, and material limits. He refined angles and proportions. He treated these systems as viable solutions, not speculative sketches. And yet, like many of his most advanced ideas, they remained unbuilt. There is no record of Leonardo attempting to deploy these machines on a large scale. No evidence that he sought permission to introduce them into workshops or construction sites. Instead, the designs stayed within his notebooks, revisited and adjusted, but never released. This restraint is significant. Leonardo was aware of the political implications of efficiency. A machine that replaces 10 workers does not only save time. It disrupts livelihoods, creates resistance. It attracts attention from authorities concerned with order and control. In a fragmented Italy defined by city-states, guild regulations, and fragile alliances, uncontrolled innovation was risky. Introducing machines that altered labor dynamics could provoke backlash not just against the invention, but against the inventor. Leonardo had already experienced instability through shifting patrons and political upheaval. He understood how quickly favor could disappear, how easily innovation could become liability. By keeping these mechanical systems on paper, Leonardo preserved the knowledge without forcing confrontation. He documented principles that would later become foundational to engineering, while avoiding the immediate consequences of implementation. This was not fear of progress. It was awareness of timing. Leonardo knew that knowledge changes power only when it is applied. And once applied, it cannot be withdrawn. Some ideas, once released, demand control that no single individual can maintain. Leonardo chose not to test that boundary. Some of the most advanced mechanisms described in the notebooks never crossed the boundary between idea and construction. Not because they were unrealistic in principle, and not because their designer lacked the ability to build them, but because turning them into working objects carried consequences that extended beyond engineering and into exposure, reputation, and responsibility. Many designs demanded precision that late 15th century workshops could not guarantee. Gear systems required tooth spacing that stayed uniform under load. Rotating assemblies needed shafts that were straight, balanced, and aligned, even after hours of motion. Bearings required surfaces smooth enough to reduce friction without seizing, and lubricants stable enough not to fail in heat or dust. A small deviation was enough to create wobble, grinding, and rapid wear. These limits were not theoretical. They were encountered during practical trials and close observation of workshop failures. The notebooks returned to the same problems with clinical patients. Friction building where two surfaces meet, vibration increasing instead of damping, joints loosening, wooden parts swelling with humidity, metal edges deforming under repeated stress. An axle that bends by a few millimeters changes the entire geometry of a mechanism. A gear that wears unevenly turns timing into noise and failure. But feasibility alone did not decide what should be built. Large mechanical projects depended on patronage. Materials, labor, workspace, and time were financed by people who expected visible results. In that environment, failure was not framed as research. It was framed as waste. A project that consumed wood, iron, and wages without producing something demonstrable could damage an engineer standing quickly, and patron protection could disappear so quickly. The political landscape made this caution rational. Patronage shifted from court to court, and what pleased one ruler could alarm the next. In Milan, a device that promised advantage could also invite suspicion if it failed publicly, or if it appeared to give an engineer influence independent of Ludovico Sforza's control. Later, in the service of Cesare Borgia, practical engineering had immediate military implications, and a copied concept could strengthen an enemy within weeks. In Rome, under Pope Leo X, an invention that looked too useful could attract scrutiny from administrators who cared more about control than novelty. There was also the problem of control once a device existed physically. A built machine could be copied. Craftsmen learned by watching. Assistants repeated what they had seen. Rivals borrowed details and claimed them as their own. Once a design left the notebook, it gained a life outside its author's supervision, and that life could not be directed. If the machine injured someone, failed spectacularly, disrupted established labor arrangements, or gave a dangerous advantage to the wrong faction, blame would follow the origin of the idea as well as the person who built it. There were few protections for inventors. A modern patent system did not exist in a reliable form, and workshop secrecy was often the only safeguard. If a mechanism proved valuable, it could be replicated without credit. If it caused harm, the association could still return to the person known to have proposed it. A design placed into circulation could become both stolen property and public liability at the same time. On paper, a design stayed private, adjustable, and deniable. Errors could be corrected without witnesses. Weaknesses could be redrawn instead of exposed. Concepts could evolve without turning into evidence of incompetence. A constructed mechanism was fixed. A written one remained flexible. Building also meant committing to a claim. Once a machine stood in front of witnesses, it declared that its maker could deliver results on demand, under scrutiny. If the device broke, jammed, or underperformed, the failure was visible, and visible failure was dangerous in a world where commissions depended on confidence. Across the notebooks, a pattern appears. As mechanical ambition increases, construction slows. Complexity accumulates faster than implementation. That gap is not an accident. It is selection. Only inventions with manageable risk were allowed to cross into reality, and only when conditions made consequences predictable. The notebooks functioned as controlled archives of possibility. They allowed ideas to exist without demanding immediate release. Some inventions arrive before the world can absorb them safely. Forcing them into existence too early can destroy both the invention and the inventor. So many designs remain silent, not abandoned, not forgotten, but intentionally restrained. When ideas remain on paper long enough, they begin to shape reality without ever entering it. The designs that stayed inside the notebooks did not disappear. They circulated indirectly. Fragments were seen by apprentices. Concepts were discussed without attribution. Principles leaked without mechanisms. The knowledge moved, but the control over it did not. This created a strange outcome. Some later engineers would approach similar problems from less advanced positions, unaware that more complete solutions had already been mapped decades earlier. They struggled publicly with challenges that had been quietly solved in private. Progress slowed not because answers were impossible, but because they were inaccessible. Keeping inventions unbuilt protected their author in the short term, but it also isolated the knowledge itself. Without physical demonstration, ideas could not defend their value. Without implementation, they could be dismissed as speculative, impractical, or theoretical. Once labeled that way, they were easier to ignore. There was also a personal cost. Patrons praised ingenuity, but rewarded results. a device that existed only as a drawing could impress, but it could not secure long-term dependence. Engineers who delivered working machines gained leverage. Those who delivered concepts gained admiration, but admiration was unstable currency. As years passed, opportunities narrowed. Courts changed priorities. Military needs shifted. New engineers emerged who were willing to simplify, compromise, and build quickly. Their machines were less elegant but visible. Their failures were tolerated because their intentions were clear. Meanwhile, the notebooks grew thicker. Ideas accumulated faster than they could be tested. Designs evolved in parallel rather than sequence. Problems were solved abstractly, then left unresolved physically. The gap between what was known and what was shown widened. This separation altered how later generations understood the work. Without context, the notebooks looked chaotic. Brilliant, but unfocused. Visionary, but incomplete. The restraint that once protected their creator was reinterpreted as hesitation or distraction. Yet restraint had been intentional. Choosing not to build was not a failure of imagination. It was a calculation shaped by risk, environment, and timing. But calculations age. What is cautious in one decade can become limiting in the next. Knowledge that remains private does not disappear. It waits. But waiting has a cost. And when that cost accumulates long enough, history remembers what was shown, not what was known. Not all ideas are lost when they remain unfinished. Some survive quietly, waiting for a different moment, a different set of tools, a different tolerance for risk. Others fade not because they were wrong, but because the world was not ready to accept what they implied. What remained after the notebooks were closed was not a collection of failures. It was a record of limits, not of imagination, but of circumstance. Limits imposed by politics, by materials, by economics, by the simple danger of being too far ahead of the systems meant to support invention. Many of the concepts would reappear centuries later, rediscovered independently, celebrated as breakthroughs, detached from their earlier origins. By then, the risks had changed. Precision tools existed. Industrial processes reduced uncertainty. Institutions protected inventors rather than exposing them. The cost of thinking differently had shifted. What once required restraint could now be rewarded. But the price had already been paid earlier, in silence rather than recognition, in notebooks rather than monuments, in potential rather than impact. This story is not about missed opportunities alone. It is about the tension between knowing and revealing, between seeing further than others and deciding how much of that vision can safely be shared. Some minds move faster than their environment. When they do, progress becomes negotiation, not acceleration. Each idea must be weighed not only for what it can do, but for what it might provoke. That negotiation shaped a legacy that feels incomplete only if we expect every insight to become an object. What survives is not always what is built first, but what endures longest. Not everything valuable is meant for immediate use. Some ideas are preserved precisely because they are delayed, protected from misuse, misunderstanding, or premature judgment. And sometimes the most advanced ideas are not the ones that change history immediately, but the ones history takes the longest time to recognize, reconstruct, and finally understand.